Sinking of the Titanic. Chapter 22. What has been accomplished by the senatorial inquiry into the loss of the Titanic, with 1,600 lives? For more than a week, of the two that have elapsed, since the Titanic made a record on her maiden voyage, a record never paralleled in marine history, for its horrors, its sacrifice of life, and material property. An earnest body of United States senators has been at work conscientiously, striving to uncover the facts, not alone for the purpose of placing the responsibility for what has now become one of the most heartrending chapters of all ocean history, but also in the hope of framing remedial legislation, looking to the prevention of its recurrence. To attempt to draw conclusions as to the value of the work of a committee, which is yet upon the threshold of its task, would be presumptuous, but it is not too soon to present and formulate some of the pertinent facts which its researchers have established in the light of sworn evidence. Any attempt at systematic analysis of the facts deduced from the many thousand of pages of testimony already taken naturally divided itself into two departments. Were the Titanic's equipment and her general state of preparedness such as to justify the broad claims made in her behalf before the crisis arose, that she represented the acme of human possibility, not only in ocean-going comfort and speed, but also in safety at sea? Were the personnel and discipline of her officers and crew of such a standard that, after the supreme crisis confronted them, they utilized to the best advantage such facilities for the safeguarding and preservation of life as remained at their disposal? With 10,000 families on both sides of the Atlantic mourning the untimely death of relatives and friends who went down into the depths, from the decks of a brand new ship, widely proclaimed the greatest and the safest that ever plowed the sea, these are, after all, the most pertinent questions that may be asked by a sorrowing world as it looks to the future rather than the past. It has been demonstrated and frankly conceded by the company's managers and officers, in the light of after knowledge, that the Titanic's life-saving appliances were woefully inadequate to the safeguarding of even one half her complement of passengers and crew. On the day after the disaster was known to the world, it was shown that the ship's equipment of lifeboats complied with the requirements of the English Board of Trade, but that those requirements were so obsolete and antiquated that they dated back to 1898, and were drafted to provide for vessels of less than 1/4 the gross tonnage of the mammoth craft of 46,000 tons of displacement. The Titanic carried on her boat deck, sometimes referred to as her sun deck, 14 of the largest regulation-size lifeboats, 7 on her port side, and 7 on the starboard. Each of these had a carrying capacity, according to the Board of Trade's established method of computation, of 65.5 persons. Their aggregate capacity when afloat, therefore, was 917. The ship carried, in addition, 4 of the so-called collapsible boats, and 2 others known as emergency boats, comparatively small craft, employed in occasional duty, as when a man falls overboard. The combined capacity of these 6 when afloat was hardly more than sufficient to care for 200 persons. At the most liberal estimate, therefore, the entire equipment of boats aboard the Great White Star liner might have afforded refuge, in the most favorable conditions, to less than 1,200 persons, or not quite half the number, actually aboard the ship on her maiden voyage. In stating the lifeboat capacity, the term "when afloat" has been used advisedly. One of the points which each of the Titanic's surviving officers has emphasized in evidence is the vast difference between loading with its human freight, a boat that has been already placed in the water, and loading one at the rail, from a deck 70 feet above the water, with the subsequent perils of lowering it, by means of the tackles sustaining its weight, from bow and stern. Several of the officers have said that, in lowering loaded boats from the rail of the Titanic's boat deck, they would consider it unwise and even dangerous to fill the boats to more than 1/2 their rated capacity. All the lifeboats that went away from the Titanic were loaded and lowered from the rail. Some of the smaller collapsible and emergency boats did not get away at all, until the ship was so low in the water, that they were simply pushed overboard, and one of them went over bottom up. Harold G. Lowe, the fifth officer, commanded a boat, which carried 58 persons aboard. This, so far as is known, is the largest number of passengers carried in any of the lifeboats. Mr. Lowe testified that as his craft was lowered away from the davits, he feared momentarily that, as a result of the tremendous strain upon her structure, she would buckle amidships and break before she reached the sustaining surface of the water, dropping all into the sea. Had one more person leapt aboard her amidships, as she was going down past the other decks, he said, it might well have proved to be the last straw. Mr. Lowe feared this might happen, as he saw steerage passengers glaring at the boat as it was lowered past the decks whereon they stood. It was for that reason, he explained to the investigating committee, that he discharged his revolver 3 times into the air, as he and his boatload were dropping past the 3 lower decks. His purpose, he said, was to show that he was armed, and to prevent any effort to overload the craft beyond a point which he already considered perilous. C. H. Lightoller, second officer and ranking surviving officer of the Titanic, expressed the opinion that, in filling lifeboats from the Titanic's boat deck, at the rail, it was involving serious risk to load them to more than half their rated capacity for filling while afloat. G. Boxhall, fourth officer, expressed a like view, but added that, in an extreme emergency, one man might take more chances than another. In view of these expert opinions, it will be seen that, when it came to loading the Titanic's passengers into lifeboats from the rail, the actual life-saving capacity of her available equipment was far less than the 1,000 or 1,100 that might have been carefully packed away into boats already resting safely on the surface of a calm sea. And this consideration, naturally, suggests the query: why were the Titanic's lifeboats all loaded from the rail of the topmost deck at a point fully 70 feet above the sea? Why were they not lowered empty, or with only the necessary officers or crew aboard, and then filled with their quota of passengers, either from some lower deck, or else, after they had reached the sustaining surface of the water? It is evident that course was contemplated. 3 of the surviving officers have testified that the available force of seamen was depleted after the ship struck, because a detail of men had been sent below to open up the gangway doors for the purpose of embarking the passengers into the lifeboats from those outlets. There is nothing in evidence as yet to show that this purpose was ever accomplished, or to reveal the fate of the men sent to do the work. Whether the men were unable or incompetent to force open the gangway doors, from which the lowered boats might easily have been filled, as the sea was as smooth as a mill pond, whether these outlets were jammed as a result of collision with the berg, or stuck because the ship's mechanisms were new, has not been revealed, and may never be known. Certain it is that all the lifeboats were loaded from the rail, and their safe capacity was thereby reduced, 1/2 in the judgment of the officers to whom their command was entrusted. The inadequacy of the Titanic's lifeboat appliances is not disputed. Steamship companies are already vying with one another to correct in this respect the admitted shortcomings of the past. The sole excuse offered is that collision bulkheads, watertight compartments, and other like devices have been regarded until now as making the marvelous vessels of the present day their own best lifeboats. The Titanic and many of her sister ships of the ocean fleets have been called unsinkable. They were generally believed to be so, and it is only since this greatest of disasters has shattered many illusions that marine engineers have confessed ruefully that the unsinkable ship has never yet been launched. Since the day of the watertight compartment and of the wireless telegraph, sea perils have been so minimized that in the most extreme of likely emergencies, the function of the lifeboat had come to be regarded as that of an ocean ferry, capable of transferring passengers safely and leisurely from an imperiled vessel to another standing by, and cooperating in the task. That was all the lifeboat had to do when the Republic sank. That was all they had to do years ago, when the Missouri, under Captain Hamilton Morrell's expert management, took off 1,000 persons, from a foundering ship, without the loss of a single life. So it had come to be believed, that the lifeboats would never be called upon, to do more than that, and least of all, in the case of the Titanic, latest and most superb of all the vessels built by man, since the world began. So deep-rooted was this conviction in the minds of seagoing men, that when Senator Smith, of Michigan, chairman of the investigating committee, asked one of the surviving officers, what was the purpose of the Titanic, carrying her 14 full-size lifeboats, he naively replied, to comply, I suppose, with the regulations of the London Board of Trade. There has been no evidence to indicate that the Titanic lacked the proper number of life jackets, or life belts. One for every person aboard the ship, and it has not been proven that these life belts were not new, and of proper quality and strength. Major Pookan, of Toronto, one of the surviving passengers, however, in the course of his testimony, made two significant comments. He said that when the Carpathia, on the morning after the disaster, steamed through a lot of the Titanic's floating wreckage, he was surprised to note great quantities of broken bits of cork, such as are used in life preservers. He was astonished also that he did not see a larger number of floating bodies. I have always supposed, said Major Pookan, who is an experienced yachtsman, that a life preserver in good condition would sustain a dead body, as well as a live one. It has been demonstrated by ample evidence that at the time the Titanic hit the iceberg, she was steaming at the undiminished speed of 21 knots an hour, into a zone littered with icebergs and floating ice fields, warning of which her officers had received hours before, by wireless from several other ships, including the America, of the Hamburg American Line. When day broke on Monday, according to Mr. Lane, at least 20 icebergs surrounded the Carpathia, the largest of which was 150 feet high. They were within a 6-mile radius. In the chart room, tucked into the corner of a frame, above the table, where the navigating officers of the Titanic did their mathematical work, was a written memorandum of the latitude and longitude, wherein 2 large icebergs had been reported directly in the track. Mr. Boxhall had worked out this position under Captain Smith's instructions. Mr. Lightoller, the second officer, was familiar with it, and when his watch ended at 10 o'clock Sunday night, and he surrendered the post on the bridge to the first officer, Mr. Murdoch, the remark was made that they would probably be inciting up into the ice during Mr. Murdoch's watch. Despite all this, the Titanic was rushing on, driving at railroad speed, toward the port of New York, and a record for a maiden voyage. It was a cloudless and starlit night, with no sea running. No extra lookout was posted in the ship's eyes, the most advanced position, on the vessel's deck. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee, both experienced lookouts, were keeping a sharp watch forward. They had been duly warned of ice, by the pair of lookouts, whom they had relieved. But the men in the crow's nest had to depend entirely upon the vision of the naked eye. They had no glass to aid them. Fleet had occupied a similar post of responsibility for years on the Oceanic without mishap. His testimony before the committee was that he never before had been without the aid of a glass. He had a pair of binoculars when the ship made her trial trip from Belfast, but they had been mislaid, and when the Titanic steamed out from Southampton, he asked Mr. Lightoller for another pair, and was told that there was no glass for him. Fleet's warning was too late to prevent the impact. His testimony was that with a glass, he would have reported the berg in time to have prevented the ship striking it. When Quartermaster Hitchens came on watch at 10 o'clock, the weather had grown so cold that he, experienced seaman that he was, immediately thought of icebergs, though it was no part of his duty to look out for them. The thermometer showed 31 degrees, and the first orders he received were to notify the ship's carpenter to look to his fresh water supply, because of the freezing weather, and to turn on the steam heating apparatus in the officers' quarters. Still no extra lookout was placed, and the men in the crow's nest were straining their tired eyes ahead, without the help of a lens. Captain Arthur Rostrom, of the Carpathia, testified that when he was rushing his ship to the aid of the stricken Titanic, taking unusual chances, because he knew lives were at stake, he placed a double watch on duty. Each of the surviving officers, when he was questioned as to the Titanic's speed at a time when the proximity of dangerous ice was definitely reported and clearly indicated by the drop in temperature, said that it was not customary to slacken speed at such times, provided the weather was clear. The custom is, they said, to go ahead and depend upon the lookouts in the crow's nest and the watch on the bridge to pick up the ice in time to avoid hitting it. Mr. Lowe, the fifth officer, who was crossing the Atlantic for the first time in his life, most of his 14 years' experience at sea, having been in the southern and eastern oceans, yawned wearily in the face of the examiner, as he admitted that he had never heard that icebergs were common off the banks of Newfoundland, and that the fact would not have interested him if he had. He did not know that the Titanic was following what is known as the southern track, and when he was asked, ventured the guess that she was on the northerly one. Questions framed by Senator Smith several times have suggested that the use of a searchlight might have saved the Titanic. Warships of all nations make the searchlight a part of their regular equipment, as is well known. The Titanic's surviving officers agreed that it has not been commonly used by vessels of the merchant marine. Some of them conceded that, in the conditions surrounding the Titanic, its use on a clear night might have revealed the iceberg in time to have saved the ship. Major Poucan, of Toronto, said emphatically that it would have done so. Mr. Lightoller, however, pointed out that, while the searchlight is often a useful device for those who stand behind it, its rays invariably blind those upon whom they are trained. Should the use of searchlights become general upon merchant vessels, he thought, it would be a matter for careful consideration, experiment and regulation. The senatorial inquiry has indicated that the single lifeboat drill upon the Titanic had been a rather perfunctory performance. There had been neither a boat drill nor a fire drill from the time the great ship left Southampton until she struck the iceberg. While she lay in harbour, before starting on her maiden voyage, and with her port side against the company pier, 2 of her lifeboats had been lowered away from her starboard side, manned by a junior or a warrant officer, and a crew of 4 men each, who rowed them around a few minutes, and then returned to the ship. There had also been an inspection in the home port, to see whether the lifeboats contained all the gear specified by the Board of Trade Regulations, and Officer Boxhall testified that they did. Yet, when the emergency came, many of the boats were found to contain no lights, while others lacked extra oars, biscuits and other specified requisites. The Titanic's loss has completely exploded the fallacy that watertight compartments, of which the big ship had 15, in her main divisions, can save a vessel from foundering, after having sustained a raking blow, tearing and ripping out her plates, from 30 feet aft of the bow, almost to midships. Mr. Lightoller expressed the belief under oath that the starboard side of the Titanic had been pierced through compartments 1, 2, 3 and probably 4, numbering from the collision bulkhead toward the midship section. The testimony of Quartermaster Hitchins showed that the vessel filled so fast that when the captain looked at the commutator, 5 minutes after the ship struck, the Titanic showed a list of 5 degrees to starboard. Rushing water drove the clerks out of the mail room before they could save their letter bags. One reform that is likely to take shape early, as a result of the senatorial investigation, is a more thorough regulation of wireless telegraphy, both in shore stations and on ships at sea. Interference by irresponsible operators will probably be checked by governmental action, and the whole subject may come up for uniform international regulation in the Berlin Conference. It is conceded that, on all ships, the receiving apparatus of the wireless instruments should be manned at all hours of the day and night, just as are the ship's bridge and the engine rooms. The Senate inquiry has showed that, had the death call of the Titanic gone out 5 minutes later, it would never have reached the Carpathia, whose one wireless operator was about to retire for the night, when he heard the signal that took the Cunard to the rescue of the 700 who survived. There has been shown, too, grave need of some cure for the jealousies and rivalries between competing systems of wireless. To the Frankfurt, which was one of the nearest, if not the nearest, of the several ships to the sinking Titanic, her operator sent the curt message, "Shut up." From the Californian the operator refused to take a message, which proved to be an ice warning, because he was busy with his accounts. With the sanction of high officers of their company, wireless operators have suppressed vital public information, for the purpose of commercializing their exclusive knowledge, for personal profit. So much for the Titanic's boasted equipment, or the lack of it. There remains to be summarized the evidence adduced as to the personnel and discipline, as these were indicated by what occurred after the ship confronted the direst of all emergencies. The Titanic was expected to make a record on her maiden voyage. She made one unapproached in ocean annals, one which, it is hoped, may long stand unparalleled. Report censures Captain of Californian. Says all passengers might have been saved but for Captain Lord's indifference. That the Titanic was rushing at a speed of 24.5 miles an hour, when she crashed into the iceberg. That of 2,223 persons aboard, only 32% were saved. That all might have been saved, but for negligent indifference of the steamship Californian to the Titanic's distress signals. That those rescued comprised 60% of the first-class passengers, 42% of second class, 25% of third class, and 24% of the crew. That forewarnings of ice ahead were ignored by the Titanic's officers. That the Titanic struck at 10:13 p.m. on Sunday, April 14, and sank at 12:47 a.m. New York time on April 15. That 8 vessels were near at time of the collision with the iceberg, and only the Carpathia went to the assistance of the Titanic. That there was no panic, but a short crew, poorly drilled, and poorly commanded, only enough men to partially man the 20 lifeboats. Teeming with eloquence, combining praise for heroism, and scathing rebuke for negligence and cowardice, in the most appalling marine tragedy of history, was the final and official requiem on May 28, in the Senate, for the victims of the Titanic. Senator Smith, of Michigan, chairman of the Senate Investigating Committee, summed up his views of the evidence developed. That every soul aboard the giant liner might have been saved, but for the indifference, inattention and almost criminal neglect of Captain Stanley Lord and the other officers of the Californian, was the most startling charge Smith bitterly made. Needless sacrifice of at least 500 lives, because the strangely insufficient number of lifeboats were not filled, was also charged. Obsolete and antiquated shipping laws, and laxity of regulation and hasty inspection by the British Board of Trade, were denounced by Smith. As a contributory cause, he named the indifference of Captain Smith, of the Titanic, for ignoring ice warnings and forcing the Titanic full speed through the northern waters. That Captain Smith had expiated his offense by a heroic death was Smith's tribute to the dead commander. Lack of discipline among the crew, and cowardice of some of its members, indicated after the crash, was scathingly arraigned. To the 2 Titanic wireless operators, Phillips and Bride, the speaker paid a glowing tribute. He lauded Captain Rostrom, of the rescue ship, Carpathia. In eloquent terms the chairman, Senator Smith, depicted the folly of sending out the greatest ship afloat, without sufficiently testing a strange crew, and with no drills or discipline. The Titanic, he said, was following the proper course, although one known to be dangerous, at that season, but the speed was gradually and continually increased, until the maximum was the death blow. Rebuke for those in half-filled lifeboats, who stood by and refused aid to struggling, drowning swimmers, until all the noise had ceased, was voiced. Upon that broken hull, the senator concluded, new vows were taken, new fealty expressed, old love renewed, and those who had been devoted in life, went proudly and defiantly, on the last life pilgrimage together. In such a heritage, we must feel ourselves, more intimately related to the sea, than ever before, and henceforth, it will send back to us on its rising tide, the cheerful salutations from those we have lost. At 10 o'clock, on that fateful Sunday evening, this latest maritime creation, was cutting its first pathway through the North Atlantic Ocean, with scarcely a ripple, to retard its progress. From the builder's hands, she was plunged straightway to her fate, and christening salvos acclaimed at once, her birth and death. Builders of renown had launched her on the billows, with confident assurance of her strength, while every port rang with praise, for their achievement. Shipbuilding to them was both a science and a religion. Parent ships and sister ships had easily withstood the waves, while the mark of their hammer was all that was needed to give assurance of the high quality of the work. In the construction of the Titanic, no limit of cost circumscribed their endeavor, and when this vessel took its place at the head of the line, every modern improvement in shipbuilding was supposed to have been realized. So confident were they that both owner and builder were eager to go upon the trial trip. No sufficient tests were made of boilers or bulkheads, or gearing or equipment, and no life-saving or signal devices were reviewed. Officers and crew were strangers to one another, and passengers to both. Neither was familiar with the vessel or its implements, or tools. No drill or station practice, or helpful discipline, disturbed the tranquility of that voyage, and when the crisis came, a state of absolute unpreparedness stupefied both passengers and crew, and, in their despair, the ship went down, carrying as needless a sacrifice of noble women and brave men as ever clustered about the judgment seat, in any single moment of passing time. We shall leave to the honest judgment of England its painstaking chastisement of the British Board of Trade, to whose laxity of regulation and hasty inspection the world is largely indebted for this awful fatality. Of contributing causes, there were very many. In the face of warning signals, speed was increased, and messages of danger seemed to stimulate her to action, rather than to persuade her to fear. Captain Smith knew the sea, and his clear eye and steady hand had often guided his ship through dangerous paths. For 40 years, storms sought in vain to vex him, or menace his craft. But once before, in all his honorable career, was his pride humbled, or his vessel maimed. Each new advancing type of ship, built by his company, was handed over to him, as a reward for faithful service, and as an evidence of confidence in his skill. Strong of limb, intent of purpose, pure in character, dauntless as a sailor should be, he walked the deck of this majestic structure, as master of her keel, Titanic though she was. His indifference to danger was one of the direct and contributing causes of this unnecessary tragedy, while his own willingness to die was the expiating evidence of his fitness to live. Those of us who knew him well, not in anger, but in sorrow, file one specific charge against him: overconfidence and neglect to heed the oft-repeated warnings of his friends. But, in his horrible dismay, when his brain was afire with honest retribution, we can still see, in his manly bearing, and his tender solicitude for the safety of women and little children, some traces of his lofty spirit, when dark clouds lowered all about him, and angry elements stripped him of his command. His devotion to his craft, even as it writhed, and twisted, and struggled for mastery over its foe, calmed the fears of many of the stricken multitude, who hung upon his words, lending dignity to a parting scene, as inspiring as it is beautiful to remember. Life belts were finally adjusted, and the lifeboats were cleared away, and, although strangely insufficient in number, were only partially loaded, and in instances, unprovided with compasses, and only 3 of them had lamps. They were manned so badly that, in the absence of prompt relief, they would have fallen easy victims to the advancing ice floe, nearly 30 miles in width, and rising 16 feet above the surface of the water. Their danger would have been as great, as if they had remained on the deck of the broken hull, and if the sea had risen, these toy targets, with over 700 exhausted people, would have been helplessly tossed about upon the waves, without food or water. The lifeboats were filled so indifferently, and lowered so quickly, that, according to the uncontradicted evidence, nearly 500 persons were needlessly sacrificed, to want of orderly discipline, in loading the few that were provided. The lifeboats would have easily cared for 1,176, and only contained 704, 12 of whom were taken into the boats, from the water, while the weather conditions were favorable, and the sea perfectly calm. And yet it is said, by some well-meaning persons, that the best of discipline prevailed. If this is discipline, what would have been disorder? Among the passengers were many strong men, who had been accustomed to command, whose lives had marked every avenue of endeavor, and whose business experience and military training especially fitted them for such an emergency. These men were rudely silenced, and forbidden to speak, as was the president of the company, by junior officers, a few of whom, I regret to say, availed themselves of the first opportunity to leave the ship. Some of the men, to whom had been entrusted the care of passengers, never reported to their official stations, and quickly deserted the ship, with a recklessness and indifference to the responsibilities of their positions, as culpable and amazing as it is impossible to believe. And some of these men say that they laid by, in their partially filled lifeboats, and listened to the cries of distress, until the noise quieted down, and surveyed from a safe distance the unselfish men and women, and faithful fellows officers and seamen, whose heroism lightens up this tragedy, and recalls the noblest traditions of the sea. Some things are dearer than life itself, and the refusal of Phillips and Bride, wireless operators, to desert their posts of duty, even after the water had mounted to the upper deck, because the captain had not given them permission to leave, is an example of faithfulness, worthy of the highest praise, while the final exit of the Phillips boy from the ship, and from the world, was not so swift as to prevent him from pausing long enough to pass a cup of water to a fainting woman, who fell from her husband's arm into the operator's chair, as he was tardily fleeing from his wireless apparatus, where he had ticked off the last message from his ship, and from his brain. It is no excuse that the apparatus on the Carpathia was antiquated. It easily caught the signal of distress, and spoke with other ships, nearly 200 miles away, both before and after the accident, while the operator says it was good for 250 miles. The steamship Californian was within easy reach of this ship for nearly 4 hours, after all the facts were known to operator Cottam. The captain of the Carpathia says he gave explicit directions that all official messages should be immediately sent through other ships, and messages of passengers should be given preference. According to Binns, the inspector, the apparatus on the Californian was practically new, and easily tuned to carry every detail of that calamity to the coast stations at Cape Sable and Cape Race, and should have done so. Regarding the part played after the disaster by Captain Lord of the steamship Californian, Senator Smith declares that, while it is not a pleasant duty to criticize the conduct of others, the plain truth should be told. Referring to the testimony of repeated signals given from the Californian, with Morse lights, he declared, "Most of the witnesses of the ill-fated vessel, before the committee saw plainly the light, which Captain Lord says was displayed for nearly 2 hours after the accident, while the captain, and some of the officers of the Titanic, directed the lifeboats to pull for that light, and return with the empty boats to the side of the ship." Why did the Californian display its Morse signal lamp from the moment of the collision, continuously for nearly 2 hours, if they saw nothing? And the signals which were visible to Mr. Gill, at 12:30 o'clock and afterward, and which were also seen by the captain and officer of the watch, should have excited more solicitude than was displayed by the officers of that vessel, and the failure of Captain Lord to arouse the wireless operator on his ship, who could have easily ascertained the name of the vessel in distress, and reached her in time to avert loss of life, places a tremendous responsibility upon this officer, from which it will be very difficult for him to escape. Had he been as vigilant in the movement of his vessel as he was active in displaying his own signal lamp, there is a very strong probability that every human life that was sacrificed through this disaster could have been saved. The dictates of humanity should have prompted vigilance under such conditions, and the law of Great Britain, giving effect to Article 2 of the Brussels Convention, in regard to assistance and salvage at sea, is as follows. The master, or person in charge of a vessel shall, so far as he can do so, without serious danger to his own vessel, her crew and her passengers, if any, render assistance to every person, even if such person be a subject of a foreign state at war with his Majesty, who is found at sea, in danger of being lost, and if he fails to do so, he shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. The Senate passed, on the 18th day of April last, a bill, giving effect to the same treaty, which clearly indicates the disposition of the Government of England, and our own as well, in matters of this character. Contrast, if you will, the conduct of the captain of the Carpathia in this emergency, and imagine what must be the consolation of that thoughtful and sympathetic mariner, who rescued the shipwrecked, and left the people of the world his debtor, as his ship sailed for distant seas, a few days ago. By his utter self-effacement, and his own indifference to peril, by his promptness, and his knightly sympathy, he rendered a great service to humanity. He should be made to realize the debt of gratitude this nation owes to him, while the book of good deeds, which had so often been familiar with his unaffected valor, should henceforth carry the name of Captain Rostrom to the remotest period of time. With most touching detail, he promptly ordered the ship's officers to their stations, distributed the doctors into positions of the greatest usefulness, prepared comforts for man and mother and babe, with foresight and tenderness, he lifted them from their watery imprisonment, and, when the rescue had been completed, summoned all of the rescued together, and ordered the ship's bell tolled, for the lost, and asked that prayers of thankfulness be offered by those who had been spared. It falls to the lot of few men to perform a service so unselfish, and the American Congress can honor itself no more by any single act than by writing into its laws the gratitude we feel toward this modest and kindly man. The lessons of this hour are, indeed, fruitless, and its precepts ill-conceived, if rules of action do not follow hard upon the day of reckoning. Obsolete and antiquated shipping laws should no longer encumber the parliamentary records of any government, and overripe administrative boards should be pruned of dead branches and less sterile precepts taught and applied.
The book, Sinking of the Titanic, concludes with the listing of the passengers and crew names, both saved and missing, in alphabetical order. I have chosen not to list the 2,224 names in this audiobook version. Thank you for listening. And, if you have enjoyed this audiobook, please consider liking, sharing and subscribing.